Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Sunday, January 8th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Indiana game is in 237 days, the game against Michigan in 321 days. We mentioned this story a couple of days ago, but wanted to wait for a few more details to emerge before we really talked about it in any real detail on here. And we were talking Jim Harbaugh, we were talking NCAA violations, we were talking about his future as the head coach of Michigan and or the head coach of some team in the NFL. A few more details have come out involving the NCAA case. Right now, there's been some reporting from Dan Wetzel. There's been some reporting from Chris Ballas at the Wolverine, a couple other spots, and just wanted to kind of talk through some of the stuff and let you know kind of what you sort of separate some fact from fiction and how big a deal this really is. I guess let's start with the fact that a lot of these are level 2 infractions. Level 2 infractions are relatively minor things. There was stuff about contact with players during the COVID-19 dead period, plus analysts doing some coaching of players they weren't supposed to do. But then the bigger deal was a level 1 infraction about him. You can frame it as not being honest, not cooperating with the NCAA, however you want to, about those allegations. As always, it is not the crime. It is the cover-up that gets you. That is the bigger deal, is the level 1 infraction. Tony Gerdeman is here from Buckeye Huddle. Tony, we have talked a whole bunch about Jim Harbaugh over the years. And, this is being treated as not a particularly big deal, and I think in a lot of ways it really isn't. But there are a couple interesting pieces of this to discuss, and the first one is the idea of coaches doing things you're not supposed to be doing during practices, which, how many programs are doing that? Probably a bunch. But what makes that interesting to me is, you remember the Hang 100 story? Kind of the genesis of that back in 2020 and the 2020 COVID dead period and all that kind of stuff. Number one, here he is meeting with people when he's not supposed to during the COVID dead period. But number two, the whole genesis of that was allegations from Harbaugh that Ohio State's coaches were doing more than they were supposed to be doing during that whole period. So the idea that now his coaches, some of his analysts were doing more than they were supposed to be doing kind of in that same general time frame, that's kind of interesting to me.
Well, Tom, I'm sure it just stems from the fact that he saw other people doing it and thought, if they're not going to get in trouble, then I too am going to do this. But yeah, I don't know if it was a social media post that Ohio State posted and of workouts or practice or whatever, and maybe somebody is on the field doing something they shouldn't. And Harbaugh took that and confronted Day about it on some coach's Zoom or whatever. Meanwhile, he's doing, I guess, the same thing. That's what's alleged here. So, it just goes back to my question of coaches. Why don't you name names? And I think it keeps coming back to the fact that nobody is innocent in any of this. So if you want to point fingers at somebody else can definitely probably point fingers at you. So it's just, let's just not point any fingers, because you see what happened here. Jim Harbaugh pointing fingers. Turns out he's eventually, or at the same time, doing the same thing he was accusing other people of doing.
Yeah, and we don't know exactly the time frame on this stuff. And, this is all sort of in the 2020, 2021 kind of range. And there's sort of a spectrum of what was and wasn't allowed. Obviously, whatever was being done was more than what was allowed, according to the NCAA's notice of allegations to Michigan. But we don't know exactly when this was. But again, during that COVID dead period, you had, I think, a broad variety of levels of adherence to the COVID rules. Some of the ones on the far end of the spectrum were, Arizona State and Herm Edwards, and that is one of the reasons Herm Edwards is no longer the head coach of Arizona State. But, I think you had various levels of adherence to that as well. But, it sounds like Michigan, Harbaugh was at least meeting, and this is one of the things that's alleged, is meeting, for a breakfast at the Brown Jug restaurant in Ann Arbor. There's a version of the story that I have read that Harbaugh had a hamburger for breakfast, which if you have seen people joking about hamburgers on social media, that is why. The other thing, though, Tony, that's more interesting to me, and maybe more of a big picture thing on college football, is it sure is different, the response to this, as opposed to the response to Jim Tressel, who was accused of sort of the same thing, which is essentially not being forthright and or lying to the NCAA about something that is a violation that is probably stupid that this is a violation. And, going out, buying a breakfast for recruits. That is kind of a stupid thing. That it's real nitpicky on that. That's a violation. And a lot of the stuff that Jim Tressel was accused of lying to the NCAA about is really functionally not even legal anymore. So the NCAA has basically acknowledged, yeah, this was a stupid thing, and this is not anything that we really needed to worry about. But you go back, you look at now, and it's sort of like, yeah, everyone's sort of treating the Harbaugh thing as like, okay, he bought them breakfast, and this is what you're worried about now, NCAA. You go back to the Jim Tressel era and how that was, I mean, the cover of Sports Illustrated and, the end of the world. That was like the biggest story for a long time in 2011 after that whole thing sort of broke. Yeah, it sure is interesting how views on these sorts of things and views on the NCAA have really changed over the last decade or so.
It's amazing. And even the analyst rule that was broken is about to be made so that any analyst or anybody under the roof can coach during the week. They just can't coach during the game. So basically, if you're an employee of a university, you can be an on-field coach during the week. So it's like, it's a violation today. It's not a violation tomorrow. And so why are we punishing people for this sort of thing? But it's a different world. Back in the 90s, Ohio State had a basketball recruit, Damon Flint, who was committed to Ohio State, had on his official visit, or maybe an unofficial visit, had a dinner off campus. And that off-campus dinner was on Olentangy River Road, like a quarter mile away from the Woody at that point. The Schottenstein Center, I don't even believe was there yet. But you've got campus buildings on the other side of the street now that I look at, think about this thing. But that was a violation. It was, I think, they were turned in by Bob Huggins. That was the rumor then, turned in by Bob Huggins. Eventually, Damon Flint then ends up at Cincinnati where Bob Huggins was for like a dinner that wasn't supposed to be off campus. And now, the Jim Tressel rigging raffles, it's such a different world. And we've talked about this before. And I think it all just continues to stem back to the Jerry Sandusky thing, because you had the Jim Tressel and everybody was like, this guy needs to burn. Like Ohio State needs the death penalty. Then you get to real terrible things with Penn State. And then you have the the Miami stuff where people are like, let's just let kids have fun, and I think that was the point where, what, it's time to just stop trying to punish people for stuff that isn't as important or isn't as detrimental as like actual harmful things that we saw in Happy Valley.
Yeah, as you were talking there, I think that is the moment that it happened, and you wonder, the Jim Tressel thing happened, 6 months before the Sandusky thing broke, and not very much longer before the Nevin Shapiro stuff at Miami broke. And you wonder if it had happened 12 months later, how different the perspective on those things would have been. But I was frantically trying to Google, because in my mind, the Damon Flint thing happened at the Damons north of campus. Was that where that happened?
I thought it was the Damons on Olentangy. Yeah, so that's what I had always. That was always the story that I was given. Yes. And he was given a gym bag and given a writing portfolio. It was, I'm just pulling up the Chicago Tribune article on it, which calls it, quote, a series of serious violations, which, boy howdy, times have changed just a little bit. A gym bag, a writing portfolio, and a lovely night out at Damon's with perhaps some trivia. Boy, that who among us, Tony, has not received a gym bag and done some trivia at Damon's over the years? And I think maybe one of the things they didn't put in there is everybody else competing at trivia got questions wrong on purpose. So another violation. Maybe
not the most famous or notorious trivia guru related incidents in Ohio State recruiting history, but certainly one of them. And yeah, it is that was a good one that I had really forgotten about. But yeah, that was the early 90s. So now we're going from the early 90s to the late 2000s to now the 2020s, and boy, things have changed quite a bit in the NCAA enforcement landscape, where everyone now is just kind of rolling their eyes. This does feel like a really appropriate swan song for Mark Emmert and his time as the head of the NCAA. You wonder what the future is going to hold for the NCAA, because it feels like the enforcement wing of that is kind of like, okay, now you're the Keystone Cops, so good luck with enforcing anything moving forward. You wonder if there's going to have to be some kind of a new organization, because the current one is basically Sergeant Schultzing it on duty there, and no one's particularly interested in having them enforce things anyway. I think the more interesting thing to me here is this puts a little more perspective around Harbaugh and the NFL and some of the things that have been floated there, because, he has said, some of the reports that have come out, I think it was in the Bruce Feldman report on The Athletic at one point, where he just talked about the fact that, it's sort of frustration with the college football game on the whole. It's not frustration with Michigan. It's not frustration with NIL. It's really more frustration with the college game on the whole. And I'm sure that some of that is, okay, you're coming after me for taking players to a place on near campus for a breakfast. Meanwhile, the NIL stuff is going largely unchecked and unenforced pretty much everywhere. You wonder, first of all, I think this puts some perspective on what that frustration might be like for him. But also, you wonder, is that enough? He has sort of expressed in vaguely worded statements about his future, that, very carefully worded stuff about how no one can know the future, but I expect to be back at Michigan next year. But man, is this enough to sort of push him over the edge and make him just say, you know what, screw it, we're going to go to the NFL where, the rules actually are kind of the rules?
Tom, are you asking, is this basically Jim Harbaugh suffering from senioritis and is like, I am so checked out, I will buy these kids a meal. I know it's absolutely wrong, but I'm not going to be here next year. That sort of thing where the rules don't apply. You're counting the days, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. I do think there is some frustration, and also like, really, we're going to worry about this when there's everything else going on. This is what the NCAA is going to spend their time on. And I could see him just being, first of all, he can be difficult, but this would almost be, like righteous indignation. That's sort of like, this is actually the first time righteous indignation is righteous, where it's like, you can just stonewall somebody and use it as an example of the stupidity of what the NCAA is wasting their time on. Meanwhile, in interviews with coaches, they're openly talking about how much players are getting paid and all of this. And the NCAA is like, wait, what did you say about a hamburger? What? Go rewind. Tell us about this thing. And that's what they're spending their time on. And I don't really have a problem with Jim Harbaugh being like, like giving them a hard time, being not necessarily combative, but not necessarily forthcoming, because I think Ohio State has shown people over the years, the more you tell the NCAA, the worse it's going to be for you. And the less you tell them, the better it's going to be, as we learn from everybody else. And if you're going to throw we're talking about suspensions and things like that for Jim Harbaugh for not being forthcoming with the NCAA. Would he be a martyr for that? I mean, he's a different cat, so maybe he would be like, if you want to suspend me, I will take the suspension just to show how stupid all of this is.
Yeah, and it's not like this. If he does get suspended, I'm now trying to pull up their schedule for next year.
Yeah,
their non-conference schedule next year is kind of similar to what it was this year, which is mumble, and then you get to the Big Ten. So yeah, maybe he misses a game or two. Maybe watches a game or two on TV or from the press box or whatever the case may be if he's suspended. But yeah, you wonder if this is something where it would just kind of go away if he apologized. And, then the question is, would he apologize, or would this be one of these like matter of principle things, which, again, we've sort of talked about before. Jim Harbaugh is kind of a different kind of dude, and he might not be willing to just sort of do the like non-apology and move on with things. It may be a matter of principle for him. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. It'll be much more interesting to see how the NFL thing shakes out, and whether the sources close to Jim Harbaugh who said it would be a done deal if he got an offer, are right, or if the vaguely worded, carefully worded Jim Harbaugh, gonna stay at Michigan unless someone changes the future kind of thing, like alternate timeline, whatever it is. It'll be interesting to see how that all shakes out. Should be a fun month. And then, also, hey, there's a bunch of other stuff going on in the college football world right now. National championship game on Monday. Lots of transfer portal stuff. Lots of NFL draft stuff coming up. Going to be a very busy month at BuckeyeHuddle.com as we talk about all of it. It should be lots of stuff to chat about on our Huddle board at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Mark Givler was just down in San Antonio. We talked to him on yesterday's show. But had lots of good stuff on there from the 7 Buckeye players who were there, talking about all the different stuff that he saw and heard from them. And then coming home now, and then we get to talk a little transfer portal, get to talk a little recruiting as Ohio State tries to close out its class with signing day in early February. Oh yeah, there's basketball. Oh yeah, there's women's basketball. There's hockey. There's women's hockey. The men's tennis team is ranked very highly. They're about to open their season next weekend. Lots of interesting stuff to talk about, all at BuckeyeHuddle.com. That will do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.